THE Stag-Eyed Lady by Thomas Hood (1809–1849) Vancouver, B.C. Scheherazade immediately began the following story. Ali Ben Ali,
Did you never read
his wondrous acts that chronicles relate, How there was one in pity might exceed The sack of Troy? Magnificent he sate Upon the throne of greatness, great indeed, For those that he had under him were great. The horse he rode on, shod with silver nails, Was a bashaw; bashaws have horses' tails. Ali was cruel, a most cruel one; 'Tis rumored he had strangled his own mother. Howbeit such deeds of darkness he had done, 'Tis thought he would have slain his elder brother And sister too, but happily that none Did live within harm's length of one another, Else he had sent the sun in all its blaze To endless night, and shortened the moon's days. Despotic power, that mars a weak man's wit, And makes a bad man absolutely bad, Made Ali wicked to a fault, 'tis fit Monarchs should have some check strings, but he had No curb upon his will, no, not a bit, Wherefore he did not reign well, and full glad His slaves had been to hang him, but they faltered, And let him live unhanged, and still unaltered, Until he got a sage brush of a beard, Wherein an Attic owl might roost, a trail Of bristly hair, that, honored and unsheared, Grew downward like old women, and cow's tail Being a sign of age, some gray appeared, Mingling with duskier brown its warnings pale, But yet not so poetic as when time Comes like Jack Frost, and whitens it in rhyme. Ben Ali took the hint, and much did vex His royal bosom that he had no son, No living child of the more noble sex, To stand in his morocco shoes, not one To make a negro pallid, or tread necks, When he was gone, doomed, when his days were done, To leave the very city of his fame, Without an Ali to keep up his name. Therefore he chose a lady for his love,
singling from out the herd?
One stag-eyed deer, So called, because her lustrous eyes above All eyes were dark, and timorous, and clear. Then through his muffis piously he strove, And drummed with proxy prayers Mohammed's ear, Knowing a boy for certain must come of it, Or else he was not
Praying
to his prophet. Beer will grow motherly, and ladies fair Will grow like beer, so did that stag-eyed dame. Ben Ali, hoping for a son and heir, Buoyed up his hopes, and even chose a name Of mighty hero that his child should bear, He made so certain ere his chicken came. But oh, all worldly wit is little worth, Not knoweth what to morrow will bring forth. To morrow came, and with to morrow's sun, A little daughter to this world of sins. Misfortunes never came alone, so one Brought on another, like a pair of twins. Twins! Female twins! It was enough to stun Their little wits, and scare them from their skins, To hear their father stamp, and curse, and swear, Pulling his beard, because he had no hair. Then strove their stag-eyed mother to calm down This his paternal rage, and thus addressed: "Oh, most serene, why dost thou stamp and frown, And box the compass of the royal chest? Ah! thou wilt mar that portly trunk, I own I love to gaze on. Prithee, thou hadst best Pocket thy fists, "Nay, love, if you so thin Your beard, you'll want a wig upon your chin." But not her words, nor e'en her tears could slack The quicklime of his rage, that hotter grew; He called his slave to bring an ample sack, Wherein a woman might be poked; a few Dark grimly men felt pity and looked black At this sad order, but their slaveships knew When any dared demur, his sword so bending, Cut off the head and front of their offending. For Ali had a sword, much like himself, A crooked blade, guilty of human gore; The trophies it had lopped, from many an elf, Were struck at his head quarters by the score. Not yet in peace belayed it on the shelf, But jested with it, and his wit cut sore; So that, as they of public houses speak, He often did his dozen butts a week. Therefore his slaves, with most obedient fears, Came with the sack the lady to enclose; In vain from her stag eyes, the big round tears Coursed one another down her innocent nose; In vain her tongue wept sorrow in their ears, Though there were some felt willing to oppose; Yet when their heads came in their heads that minute, Though 'twas a pious case, they put her in it. And when the sack was tied, some two or three Of these black undertakers slowly brought her To a kind of Moorish serpentine, for she Was doomed to have a winding sheet of water. Then farewell, earth, farewell to the green tree, Farewell the sun, the moon, each little daughter; She shot from off the shoulders of a black, Like bag of Wall's End from a coalman's back. The waters opted, and the wide sack, full filled All that the waters opted, as down it fell; Then closed the wave, and then the surface rilled A ring above her, like a water knell. A moment more, and all its face was stilled, And not a guilty heave was left to tell That underneath its calm and blue transparence A dame lay drowned in her sack, like Clarence. But Heaven beheld, and awful witness bore The moon in black eclipse, deceased the night, Like Desdemona smothered by the Moor; The lady's natal star was pale of fright, Fainted and fell, and what were stars before, Turned comets as the tale was brought to light, And all looked downward on the fatal wave, And made their own reflections on her grave. Next night a head, a little lady head, Pushed through the waters, a most glassy face, With weedy tresses, thrown apart and spread, Coned by live ivory, to show the space Of a pale forehead, and two eyes that shed A soft blue mist, breathing a bloomy grace Over their sleepy lids; and so she raised Her aquiline nose above the stream, and gazed. She opted her lips, lips of a gentle blush, So pale it seemed near drowned to a white; She opted her lips, and forth there sprang a gush Of music bubbling through the surface light. The leaves are motionless, the breezes hush To listen to the air, and through the night There come these words of a most plaintive ditty, Sobbing as they would break all hearts with pity. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. The Water Perry's Song and the Irish Schoolmaster by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Water Perry's Song. Farewell, farewell to my mother's own daughter, The child that she wet nurse is lapped in the wave. The Mussulman, coming to fish in this water, adds a tear to the flood that weeps over her grave. This sack is her coffin, this water's her bier, this grayish bath cloak is her funeral pall, and stranger, O stranger, this song that you hear is her epitaph, elegy, dirges, and all. Farewell, farewell to the child of Al Hassan, my mother's own daughter, the last of her race. She's a corpse, the poor body, and lies in this basin, and sleeps in the water that washes her face. The Irish Schoolmaster. Alack! 'tis melancholy theme to think How learning doth in rugged states abide, And like her bashful owl obscurely blink In pensive glooms and corners scarcely spied, Not as in founders' halls and domes of pride, Served with grey homage, like a tragic queen, But with one lonely priest compelled to hide, In midst of foggy moors, and mosses green, In that clay cabin high the College of Kilrain. This college looketh south and west alose, Because it hath a cast in windows twain, Crazy and cracked they be, and wind doth blow Through transparent holes in every pane, Which Pan, with many pains, makes whole again, With nether garments, which his thrift doth teach To stand for glass, like pronouns, and when rain Stormeth he puts once more unto the breach, Outside and in, though broke, yet so he mendeth each. And in the midst a little door there is, Whereon a board that doth congratulate, With painted letters, red as blood I wis, Thus written, "Children taken in to bait." And oft indeed the inward of that gate, Most ventriloque, doth utter tender squeak, And moans of infants that bemoan their fate, In midst of sounds of Latin, French, and Greek, Which all the Irish tongue he teacheth them to speak. For some are meant to right illegal wrongs, And some for doctors of divinity, Whom he doth teach to murder the dead tongues, And so win academical degree. But some are bred for service of the sea, Howbeit, their store of learning is but small, For mickle waste he counteth it would be, To stock a head with bookish wares at all, Only to be knocked off by ruthless cannon ball. 6 babes he sways, some little and some big, Divided into classes 6, also, He keeps a parlor boarder of a pig, That in the college fareth to and fro, And picketh up the urchins' crumbs below, And eke the learned rudiments they scan, And thus his A B C doth wisely know, Hereafter to be shown in caravan, And raise the wonderment of many a learned man. Also, he schools some tame familiar fowls, Whereof, above his head, some 2 or 3 Sit darkly squatting, like Minerva's owls, But on the branches of no living tree, And overlook the learned family, While sometimes, Partlet, from her gloomy perch, Drops feather on the nose of Dominie. Meanwhile with serious eye he makes research In leaves of that sour tree of knowledge, now a birch. No chair he hath, the awful pedagogue, Such as would magisterial hams embed, But sitteth lowly on a beechen log, Secure in high authority and dread. Large as a dome, for learning, seems his head, And like Apollo's, all beset with rays, Because his locks are so unkempt and red, And stand abroad in many several ways. No laurel crown he wears, howbeit his cap is baize. And underneath a pair of shaggy brows O'erhang as many eyes of gizzard hue, That inward giblet of a fowl, which shows A mongrel tint, that is ne brown ne blue. His nose Is a coral to the view, Well nourish'd with Pierian potheen, For much he loves his native mountain dew, But to depict the dye would lack, I ween, A bottle red in terms, as well as bottle green. As for his coat, 'tis such a jerkin short, As Spenser had, ere he composed his tales, But underneath he hath no vest, nor aught, So that the wind his airy breast assails. Below he wears the nether garb of mails, Of crimson plush, but not plush'd at the knee, Thence further down the native red prevails, Of his own naked fleecy hosiery. Two sandals, without soles, complete his cap a pie. Nathless, for dignity, he now doth lap His function in magisterial gown, That shows more countries in it than a map, Blue tinct, and red, and green, and russet brown, Besides some blots, standing for county town, And eke some rents, for streams and rivers wide. But sometimes, bashful when he looks adown, He turns the garment of the other side, Hopeful that so the holes may never be espied. And so he sits, amidst the little pack, That looks for shady or for sunny noon, Within his visage, like an almanack, His quiet smile foretelling gracious boon; But when his mouth droops down, like rainy moon, With horrid chill each little heart unwarms, Knowing that infant showers will follow soon, And with forebodings of near wrath and storms, They sit, like timid hares, all trembling on their forms. Ah, luckless wight, who cannot then repeat Corduroy colloquy, or qui que caude, For soon his tears shall make his turfy seat More sodden, though already made of sod, For Dan shall whip him with the word of God, Severe by rule, and not by nature mild. He never spoils the child and spares the rod, But spoils the rod and never spares the child, And so with holy rule deems he is reconciled. But surely the just sky will never wink At men who take delight in childish throw, And stripe the nether urchin like a pink, Or tender hyacinth, inscribed with woe, Such bloody pedagogues, when they shall know, By useless birches, that forlorn recess, Which is no holiday, in pit below, Will hell not seem designed for their distress? A melancholy place, is that all, bottomless? Yet would the Muse not chide the wholesome use Of needful discipline, in due degree, Devoid of sway, what wrongs will time produce, Whene'er the twig untrained grows up a tree? This shall a Carter, that a Whiteboy be, Ferocious leaders of atrocious bands, And learning's help be used for infamy, By lawless kirks, that, with their bloody hands, In murdered English right wrought murderous commands. But ah! what shrilly cry doth now alarm The sooty fowls that dozed upon the beam, All sudden fluttering from the brandished arm, And crackling chorus with the human scream. Meanwhile the scourge plies that unlikely seem In Flim's brogues, which bares his naked skin, Like traitor Gap in warlike fort, I deem, That falsely lets the fierce besieger in, Nor seeks the pedagogue by other course to win. No parent dear he hath to heed his cries, Alas, his parent dear is far aloof, And deep in Seven Dial cellar lies, Killed by kind cudgel play, or gin of proof, Or climbeth catwise on some London roof, Singing, perchance, a lay of Erin's Isle, Or whilst he labours, weaves a fancy woof, Dreaming he sees his home, his Phelim smile. Ah me! that luckless imp, who weepeth all the while! Ah! who can paint that hard and heavy time, When first the scholar lists in learning's train, And mounts her rugged steep, in force to climb, Like sooty imp, by sharp posterior pain, From bloody twig, and eke that Indian cane, Wherein, alas! no sugar'd juices dwell, For this, the whole one striplin sluices drain, Another weepeth over chilblains fell, Always upon the heel, yet never to be well. Anon a third, for his delicious root, Late ravish'd from his tooth by elder chit, So soon is human violence afoot, So hardly is the harmless biter bit. Meanwhile the tyrant, with untimely wit, And mouthing face, derides the small one's moan, Who, all lamenting for his loss, doth sit. Alack! mischance comes seldomtimes alone, But aye the worried dog must rue more curs than one. For lo! the pedagogue, with sudden drub, Smites the scald head, that is already sore, Superfluous wound, such is misfortune's rub, Who straight makes answer with redoubled roar, And sheds salt tears twice faster than before, That still with backward fist he strives to dry, Washing with brackish moisture o'er and o'er His muddy cheek, that grows more foul thereby, Till all his rainy face looks grim as rainy sky. So Dan, by dint of noise, obtains a peace, And with his natural undertender knack, By new distress bids former grievance cease, Like tears dried up with rugged huck a back, That sets the mournful visage all a wrack. Yet soon the childish countenance will shine, Even as thorough storms the soonest slack, For grief and beef in adverse ways incline, This keeps and that decays, when duly soaked in brine. Now all is hushed, and with a look profound, The Dominie lays op the learned page, So be it called, although he doth expound, Without a book, both Greek and Latin sage; Now telleth he of Rome's rude infant age, How Romulus was bred in savage wood, By wet nurse wolf, devoid of wolfish rage, And laid foundation stone of walls and mud, But water'd it, alas! with warm fraternal blood. Anon, he turns to that Homeric war, How Troy was sieged like Londonderry town, And stout Achilles, at his jaunting car, Dragged mighty Hector with a bloody crown, And eke the bard, that sung of their renown, In garb of Greece, most beggar like and torn, He paints with Colley, wandering up and down, Because at once, in 7 cities born, And so, of parish rites, was, all his days, forlorn. Anon, through old mythology he goes, Of gods defunct, and all their pedigrees, But shuns their scandalous amours, and shows How Plato wise, and clear eyed Socrates, Confessed not to those heathen he's and she's, But thro' the clouds of the Olympic cope, Beheld St. Peter with his holy keys, And owned their love was naught, and bowed to Pope, Whilst all their purblind race in pagan mist did grope. From such quaint themes he turns, at last aside, To new philosophies, that are still are green, and shows what railroads have been tracked to guide the wheels of great political machine. If English corn should grow abroad, I ween, and gold be made of gold, or paper sheet, how many pigs be born to each spalpeen, and ah, how man shall thrive beyond his meat, with 20 souls alive to one square sod of peat. Here he makes end, and all the fry of youth, that stood around with serious look intense, close up again their gaping eyes and mouth, which they had opened to his eloquence, as if their hearing were a threefold sense. But now the current of his words is done, and whether any fruit shall spring from thence, in future time, with any mother's son, it is a thing, God wot, that can be told by none. Now by the creeping shadows of the noon, the hour is come to lay aside the lore. The cheerful Penegose perceives it soon, and cries begone, until the imps, and four, snatch their 2 hats and struggle for the door, like ardent spirits vented from a cask, all blithe and boisterous, but leave 2 more, with reading made uneasy for a task, to weep, whilst all their mates in merry sunshine bask. Like supported elfins on the verdant sod, with tender moss so sleekly overgrown, that doth not hurt but kiss the soul unshod, so soothly kind is Erin to her own, and one, at hare and hound, plays all alone, for Phim's gone to tend his stepdame's cow. Ah, Phim's stepdame is a cankered crone, while other twain play at an Irish row, and with Sheila Small break one another's brow. But careful Dominie, with ceaseless thrift, now changeth Feraud for rural hoe, but first of all with tender hand doth shift his college gown, because of solar glow, and hangs it on a brush, to scare the crow. Meanwhile he plants in earth the dappled bean, or trains the young potatoes all a row, or plucks the fragrant leek for pottage green, with that crispy curly herb, called kale in Aberdeen. And so he wisely spends the fruitful hours, linked each to each by labour, like a bee, or rules in learning's hall, or trims her bowers. Would there be many more such waits as he, to sway each capital academy of Cam and Isis, for, alack, at each there dwells I wot some donnish dominie, that does no garden work, nor yet doth teach, but wears a flowery head, and talks in flowery speech. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
Faithless Nellie Gray by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Faithless Nellie Gray, a pathetic ballad. Ben Battle was a soldier bold and used to war's alarms, but a cannon ball took off his legs, so he laid down his arms. Now as they bore him off the field, said he, "Let others shoot, for here I leave my second leg and the 42nd foot." The army surgeons made him limbs. Said he, "They're only pegs, but they're as wooden members quite as represent my legs." Now Ben he loved a pretty maid, her name was Nellie Gray, so he went to pay her his devours, when he'd devoured his pay. But when he called on Nellie Gray, she made him quite a scoff, and when she saw his wooden legs, began to take them off. "Oh, Nelly Gray, oh, Nelly Gray, is this your love so warm? The love that loves a scarlet coat should be more uniform." Said she, "I loved a soldier once, for he was blithe and brave, but I will never have a man with both legs in the grave. Before you had those timber toes, your love I did allow, but then, you know, you stand upon another footing now. Oh, Nelly Gray, oh, Nelly Gray, for all your jeering speeches, at duty's call I left my legs in Badajo's breeches." "Why, then," said she, "you've lost the feat of legs in war's alarms, and now you cannot wear your shoes upon your feats of arms." "Oh, false and fickle Nelly Gray, I know why you refuse. Though I've no feet, some other man is standing in my shoes. I wish I ne'er had seen your face, but now a long farewell, for you will be my death, alas, you will not be my Nell." Now when he went from Nelly Gray, his heart so heavy got, and life was such a burthen grown, it made him take a knot. So round his melancholy neck a rope he did entwine, and for his second time in life enlisted in the line. One end he tied around a beam, and then removed his pegs, and as his legs were off, of course he soon was off his legs. And there he hung till he was dead as any nail in town, for though distress had cut him up, it could not cut him down. A dozen men sat on his corpse to find out why he died, and they buried Ben in 4 crossroads, with the stake in his inside. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
Bianca's Dream by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Sonia. Bianca's Dream. A Venetian Story. 1. Bianca, fair Bianca, who could dwell with safety on her dark and hazel gaze, nor find there lurked in it a witching spell, fatal to balmy nights and blessed days? The peaceful breath that made the bosom swell she turned to gas, and set it in a blaze. Each eye of hers had love's Eupyrean in it, that he could light his link at in a minute. 2. So that, wherever in her charms she shone, 1,000 breasts were kindled into flame. Maidens who cursed her looks forgot their own, and bows were turned to flambeaux where she came. All hearts indeed were conquered but her own, which none could ever temper down or tame. In short, to take our haberdasher's hints, she might have written over it, "From Flints." 3. She was, in truth, the wonder of her sex, at least in Venice, where with eyes of brown, tenderly languid, ladies seldom vex an amorous gentle with a needless frown; where gondolas convey guitars by pecks, and love at casements climbeth up and down, whom for his tricks and custom in that kind some have considered a Venetian blind. 4. Howbeit, this difference was quickly taught amongst more youth, who had this cruel jailor, to hapless Julio, all in vain he sought with each new moon his hatter and his tailor. In vain the richest paduasoy he bought, and went in bran new beaver to assail her, as if to show that love had made him smart all over, and not merely round his heart. 5. In vain he laboured through the sylvan park Bianca haunted in, that where she came, her learned eyes in wondering might mark the twisted cipher of her maiden name wholesomely going through a course of bark. No one was touched or troubled by his flame except the dryads, those old maids that grow In trees, like wooden dolls in embryo. 6. In vain complaining elegies he writ, And taught his tuneful instrument to grieve, And sang in quavers how his heart was split, Constant beneath her lattice with each eve. She mocked his wooing with her wicked wit, And slashed his suit so that it matched his sleeve, Till he grew silent at the vesper star, And, quite despairing, hamstringed his guitar. 7. Bianca's heart was coldly frosted o'er With snows unmelting, an eternal sheet, But his was red within him like the core Of old Vesuvius, with perpetual heat, And oft he longed internally to pour His flames and glowing lava at her feet, But when his burnings he began to spout, She stopped his mouth, and put the crater out. 8. Meanwhile he wasted in the eyes of man, So thin, he seemed a sort of skeleton key Suspended at death's door, so pale, and then He turned as nervous as an aspen tree. The life of man is 60 and 10, But he was perishing at 23. For people truly said, as grief grew stronger, It could not shorten his poor life much longer. 9. For why, he neither slept, nor drank, nor fed, Nor relished any kind of mirth below. Fire in his heart, and frenzy in his head, Love had become his universal foe. Salt in his sugar, nightmare in his bed. At last, no wonder wretched Julio, A sorrow ridden thing, in utter dearth Of hope, made up his mind to cut her girth. 10. For hapless lovers always died of old, Sooner than chew reflection's bitter cud. So Thisbe stuck herself; what time 'tis told, The tender hearted mulberries wept blood. And so poor Sappho, when her boy was cold, Drowned her salt tear drops in a salter flood. Their fame still breathing, though their breath be past, For those old suitors lived beyond their last. 11. So Julio went to drown, when life was dull, But took his corks, and merely had a bath; And once he pulled a trigger at his skull, But merely broke a window in his wrath; And once, his hopeless being to annul, He tied a pack thread to a beam of lath, A line so ample 'twas a query whether 'Twas meant to be a halter or a tether. 12. Smile not in scorn that Julio did not thrust His sorrows through; 'tis horrible to die, And come down with our little all of dust, That dun of all the duns to satisfy. To leave life's pleasant city, as we must, In death's most dreary sponging house to lie, Where even all our personals must go, To pay the debt of nature that we owe. 13. So Julio lived; 'twas nothing but a pet He took at life, a momentary spite. Besides, he hoped that time would some day get The better of love's flame, how over bright; A thing that time has never compassed yet, For love, we know, is an immortal light, Like that old fire that, quite beyond a doubt, Was always in, for none have found it out. 14. Meanwhile Bianca dreamed; 'twas once when night Along the darkened plain began to creep, Like a young Hottentot, whose eyes are bright, Although in skin as sooty as a sweep. The flowers had shut their eyes; the zephyr light Was gone, for it had rocked the leaves to sleep, And all the little birds had laid their heads Under their wings, sleeping in feather beds. 15. Lone in her chamber sate the dark eyed maid, By easy stages jaunting through her prayers, But listening sidelong to a serenade That robbed the saints a little of their shares. For Julio underneath the lattice played His De Vieni, and such amorous airs Born only underneath Italian skies, Where every fiddle has a bridge of sighs. 16. Sweet was the tune, the words were even sweeter, praising her eyes, her lips, her nose, her hair, with all the common tropes wherewith in metre the hackney poets overcharge their fair. Her shape was like Diana's, but completer, her brow with Grecian Helen's might compare. Cupid, alas, was cruel Sagittarius, Julio, the weeping waterman, Aquarius. 17. Now after listing to such laudings rare, 'twas very natural indeed to go, what if she did postpone one little prayer, to ask her mirror, if it was not so? 'Twas a large mirror, none the worse for wear, reflecting her at once from top to toe, and there she gazed upon that glossy track, that showed her front face, though it gave her back. 18. And long her lovely eyes were held in thrall by that dear page where first the woman reads, that Julio was no flatterer, none at all, she told herself, and then she told her beads. Meanwhile the nerves insensibly let fall 2 curtains fairer than the lily breeds, for sleep had crept and kissed her unawares, just at the half-way milestone of her prayers. 19. Then, like a drooping rose, so bended she, till her bowed head upon her hand reposed, but still she plainly saw, or seemed to see, that fair reflection, though her eyes were closed, a beauty bright as it was wont to be, a portrait fancy painted while she dozed. 'Tis very natural, some people say, to dream of what we dwell on in the day. 20. Still shone her face, yet not, alas, the same, but 'gan some dreary touches to assume, and sadder thoughts with sadder changes came. Her eyes resigned their light, her lips their bloom, her teeth fell out, her tresses did the same, her cheeks were tinged with bile, her eyes with rheum. There was a throbbing at her heart within, for oh, there was a shooting in her chin. 21. And lo, upon her sad desponding brow the cruel trenches of besieging age, with seams, but most unseemly, 'gan to show. Her place was booking for the 7th stage. And where her raven tresses used to flow, some locks that time had left her in his rage, and some mock ringlets made her forehead shady, a compound, like our psalms, of Tate and Brady. 22. Then for her shape, alas, how Saturn racks and bends and corkscrews all the frame about, doubles the hems, and crooks the straightest necks, draws in the nape, and pushes forth the snout, makes backs and stomachs concave or convex. Witness those pensioners called in and out, who all day watching first and second rater, quaintly unbend themselves, but grow no straighter. 23. So Time with fair Bianca dealt, and made her shape a bow, that once was like an arrow. His iron hand upon her spine he laid, and twisted all awry her winsome marrow. In truth it was a change. She had obeyed the holy Pope before her chest grew narrow, but spectacles and palsy seemed to make her something between a Glassite and a Quaker. 24. Her grief and gall meanwhile were quite extreme, and she had ample reason for her trouble. For what sad maiden can endure to seem set in for singleness, though growing double? The fancy maddened her, but now the dream, grown thin by getting bigger, like a bubble, burst, but still left some fragments of its size, that, like the soap-suds, smarted in her eyes. 25. And here, just here, as she began to heed the real world, her clock chimed out its score. A clock it was of the Venetian breed, that cried the hour from 1 to 24. The works, moreover, standing in some need of workmanship, it struck some dozens more. A warning voice that clenched Bianca's fears, such strokes referring doubtless to her years. 26. At 15 chimes she was but half a nun. By 20 she had quite renounced the veil. She thought of Giulio just at 21, and 30 made her very sad and pale. To paint that ruin where her charms would run, at 40 all the maid began to fail, and thought no higher, as the late dream crossed her, of single blessedness than single Gloucester. 27. And so Bianca changed. The next sweet even, with Giulio in a black Venetian bark, rode slow and stealthily, the hour 11, just sounding from the tower of old St. Mark. She sate with eyes turned quietly to heaven, perchance rejoicing in the grateful dark that veiled her blushing cheek, for Giulio brought her, of course, to break the ice upon the water. 28. But what a puzzle is one's serious mind to open! Oysters, when the ice is thick, are not so difficult and disinclined, and Giulio felt the declaration stick about his throat in a most awful kind. However, he contrived by bits to pick his trouble forth, much like a rotten cork, groped from a long-necked bottle with a fork. 29. But love is still the quickest of all readers, and Giulio spent besides those signs profuse that English telegraphs and foreign pleaders, in help of language, are so apt to use. Arms, shoulders, fingers, all were interceders. Nods, shrugs, and bends, Bianca could not choose but soften to his suit with more facility, he told his story with so much agility. 30. Be thou my park, and I will be thy deer, so he began at last to speak or quote. Be thou my bark, and I thy gondolier, for passion takes this figurative note. Be thou my light, and I thy chandelier, be thou my dove, and I will be thy cote. My lily be, and I will be thy river, be thou my life, and I will be thy liver. 31. This, with more tender logic of the kind, he poured into her small and shell-like ear, that timidly against his lips inclined. Meanwhile her eyes glanced on the silver sphere that even now began to steal behind a dewy vapour, which was lingering near, wherein the dull moon crept all dim and pale, just like a virgin putting on the veil. 32. Bidding adieu to all her sparks, the stars that erst had wooed and worshipped in her train, Saturn and Hesperus and gallant Mars, never to flirt with heavenly eyes again. Meanwhile, remindful of the convent bars, Bianca did not watch these signs in vain, but turned to Giulio at the dark eclipse, with words like verbal kisses on her lips. 33. He took the hint full speedily, and, backed by love and night and the occasion's meetness, bestowed a something on her cheek that smacked, though quite in silence, of ambrosial sweetness, that made her think all other kisses lacked, till then, but what she knew not of completeness, being used but sisterly salutes to feel insipid things like sandwiches of veal. 34. He took her hand, and soon she felt him wring the pretty fingers all instead of one. Anon his stealthy arm began to cling about her waist that had been clasped by none. Their dear confessions I forbear to sing, since cold description would but be outrun, for bliss and Irish watches have the power in 20 minutes to lose half an hour. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
The Demon Ship by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Larry Wilson. 'Twas off the wash, the sun went down, the sea looked black and grim, for stormy clouds with murky fleece were mustering at the brim. Titanic shades, enormous gloom, as if the solid night of Erebus arose suddenly to seize upon the light. It was a time for mariners to bear a wary eye, with such a dark conspiracy behind the sea and sky. Down went my helm, close reefed, The tack held freely in my hand, with ballast snug. I put about and scudded for the land. Loud hissed the sea beneath her lee. My little boat flew fast, but faster still the rushing storm came borne upon the blast. Lord, what a roaring hurricane beset the straining sail! What furious sleet with level drift, and fierce assaults of hail! What darksome caverns yawned before, what jagged steeps behind! Little battle steeds with foamy manes, each after each sank down astern, exhausted in the chase. But where it sank another rose, and galloped in its place. As black as night they turned to white, and cast against the cloud a snowy sheet, as if each surge upturned a sailor's shroud. Still flew my boat. Alas, alas, her course was nearly run! Behold yon fatal billow rise, 10 billows heaped in one! With fearful speed the dreary mass came rolling, rolling fast, as if the scooping sea contained one only wave at last. Still on it came with horrid roar a swift pursuing grave. It seemed as though some cloud had turned its hugeness to a wave. Its briny sleet began to beat beforehand in my face. I felt the rearward keel begin to climb its swelling base. I saw its alpine hoary head impending over mine. Another pulse, and down it rushed, an avalanche of brine. Brief pause had I on God to cry, or think of wife and home. The waters closed, and when I shrieked below the foam. Beyond that rush I have no hint of any after deed, for I was tossing on the waste, as senseless as a weed. Where am I? In the breathing world, or in the world of death? With sharp and sudden pang I drew another breath of breath. My eyes drank in a doubtful light, my ears a doubtful sound. And was that ship a real ship, whose tackle seemed around? A moon, as if the earthly moon was shining up aloft. But were those beams the very beams that I had seen so oft? A face that mocked the human face before me watched alone. But were those eyes the eyes of man that looked against my own? Oh, never may the moon again disclose me such a sight as met my gaze, when first I looked on that accursed night. I've seen 1,000 horrid shapes begot of fierce extremes of fever, and most frightful things have haunted in my dreams. Hyenas, cats, blood-loving bats, and apes with hateful stare, pernicious snakes and shaggy bulls, the lion and she-bear, strong enemies with Judas looks, of treachery and spite, detested features, hardly dimmed and banished by the light, pale sheeted ghosts with gory locks upstarting from their tombs, all fantasies and images that flit in midnight glooms. Hags, goblins, demons, lemures have all made me aghast, but nothing like the grimly one who stood beside the mast. His cheek was black, his brow was black, his eyes and hair as dark, his hands was black, and where it touched it left a sable mark. His throat was black, his vest the same, and when I looked beneath, his breast was black. All was black except his grinning teeth. His sooty crew were like in hue, as black as Afric slaves. Oh, horror! E'en the ship was black that ploughed the inky waves. Alas! I cried, for love of truth and blessed mercy's sake, where am I? In what dreadful ship? Upon what dreadful lake? What shape is that so very grim and black as any coal? It is Mahound, the evil one, and he has gained my soul. O mother dear, my tender nurse, dear meadows that beguiled my happy days when I was yet a little sinless child, my mother dear, my native fields I never more shall see. I'm sailing in the devil's ship upon the devil's sea. Loud laughed the sable mariner, and loudly in return his sooty crew sent forth a laugh that rang from stem to stern. A dozen pair of grimly cheeks were crumpled on the nunce, as many sets of grinning teeth came shining out at once. A dozen gloomy shapes at once enjoyed the merry fit, with shriek and yell and oaths as well, like demons of the pit. They cowered their fill, and then the chief made answer for the whole. "Our skins," he said, "are black, ye see, because we carry coal. You'll find your mother sure enough, and see your native fields, for this here ship has picked you up, the Mary Ann of Shields." End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
Tim Turpin, A Pathetic Ballad, by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Recording Person. Tim Turpin, A Pathetic Ballad. Tim Turpin he was gravel blind, and ne'er had seen the skies, for mature when his head was made, forgot to dot his I's. So like a Christmas pedagogue, what Tim was forced to do, look out for pupils, for he had a vacancy for 2. There's some have specs to help their sight of objects dim and small, but Tim had specs within his eyes and could not see at all. Now Tim he wooed a servant maid and took her to his arms, for he like Pyramus had cast a walleye on her charms. By day she led him up and down where'er he wished to jog, a happy wife although she led the life of any dog. But just when Tim had lived a month in honey with his wife, a surgeon opened his Milton eyes like oysters with a knife. But when his eyes were opened thus, he wished them dark again, for when he looked upon his wife, he saw her very plain. Her face was bad, her figure worse, he couldn't bear to eat, for she was anything but like a grace before his meat. Timmy was a feeling man, for when his sight was thick, he made him feel for everything, but that was with the stick. So with the cudgel in his hand, it was not light or slim, he knocked at his wife's head until it opened unto him. And when the corpse was stiff and cold, he took his slaughtered spouse, and laid her in a heap with all the ashes of her house. But like a wicked murderer, he lived in constant fear, from day to day, and so he cut his throat from ear to ear. The neighbours fetched a doctor in, said he, "This wound I dread can hardly be sewed up, his life is hanging on a thread." But when another week was gone, he gave him stronger hope, instead of hanging on a thread, of hanging on a rope. How when he hid his bloody work in ashes round about, how little he supposed the truth would soon be sifted out. But when the parish dustman came his rubbish to withdraw, he found more dust within the heap than he contracted for. A dozen men to try the fact were sworn that very day, but though they all were jurors, yet no conjurers were they. Said Tim unto these jurymen, "You need not waste your breath, for I confess myself at once the author of her death. And oh, when I reflect upon the blood that I have spilt, just like a button is my soul, inscribed with double guilt." Then turning round his head again, he saw before his eyes a great judge and a little judge, the judges of assize. The great judge took his judgment cap and put it on his head, and sentenced Tim by law to hang till he was 3 times dead. So he was tried and he was hung, fit punishment for such, on Horsham drop, and none can say it was a drop too much. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
Death's Ramble by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Larry Wilson. One day the dreary old king of death inclined for some sport with the carnal, so he tied a pack of darts on his back, and quietly stole from his charnel. His head was bald of flesh and of hair, his body was lean and lank, his joints at each stir made a crack, and the cur took a gnaw by the way at his shank. And what did he do with his deadly darts, this goblin of grisly bone? He dabbled and spilled man's blood, and he killed like a butcher that kills his own. The first he slaughtered it made him laugh, for the man was a coffin maker, to think how the mutes the men in black suits would mourn for an undertaker. Death saw two Quakers sitting at church. Quoth he, "We shall not differ." But he let them alone, like figures of stone, for he could not make them stiffer. He saw two duellists going to fight, in fear they could not smother, and he shot one through at once, for he knew they never would shoot each other. He saw a watchman fast in his box, and he gave a snore infernal. Said Death, "Nay, he may keep his breath, for his sleep can never be more eternal." He met a coachman driving his coach so slow that his fare grew sick, but he let him stay on his tedious way, for Death only wars on the quick. Death saw a tollman taking a toll, in spirit of his fraternity, but he knew that sort of man would exhort, though summoned to all eternity. He found an author writing his life, but he let him write no further, for Death, who strikes whenever he likes, is jealous of all self-murther. Death saw a patient that pulled out his purse, and a doctor that took the sum, but he let them be, for he knew that the fee was a prelude to faw and fum. He met a dustman ringing a bell, and he gave him a mortal thrust, for he himself by law, since Adam's flaw, is contractor for all our dust. He saw a sailor mixing his grog, and he marked him out for a slaughter, for on water he scarcely had cared for Death, and never on rum and water. Death saw two players playing at cards, but the game wasn't worth a dump, for he quickly laid them flat with a spade, to wait for the final trump. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
A Sailor's Apology for Bowlegs by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. There's some is born with their straight legs by nature, and some is born with bow legs from the first, and some that should have grown a good deal straighter, but they were badly nursed, and set you see like Bacchus, with their pegs, astride of cask and kegs. I got myself a sort of bow to larboard and starboard, and this is what it was that warped my legs. 'Twas all along of Paul, as I may say, that fouled my cable when I ought to slip, but on the 10th of May, when I gets under way, down there in Hertfordshire to join my ship, I sees the Mail get under sail, the only one there was to make the trip. Well, I gives chase, but as she run 2 knots to 1, there warn't no use in keeping on the race. Well, casting round about what next to try on, and how to spin, I spies an ensign with a bloody lion, and bears away to leeward for the inn, beats round the gable, and fetches up before the coach horse stable. Well, there they stand, 4 kickers in a row, and so I just makes free to cut a brown un's cable, but riding isn't in a seaman's nature, so I whips out a toughish end of yarn, and gets a kind of sort of a land waiter, to splice me, heel to heel, under the she mare's keel, and off I goes, and leaves the inn astarn. My eyes, how she did pitch, and wouldn't keep her own to go in no line, though I keep bowsing at her bow line, but always making lee way to the ditch, and yawed her head about all sorts of ways, the devil sink the craft. And wasn't she tremendous slack in stays, we couldn't, no how, keep the inn abaft. Well, I suppose, we hadn't run a knot, or much beyond. What will you have on it? but off she goes, up to her bends in a fresh water pond. There I am, all aback. So I looks forward to her bridle gears, to heave her head round on the other track. But when I starts, the leather parts, and goes away right over by the ears. What could a fellow do, whose legs, like mine, you know, were in the bilboes, but trim myself upright for bringing to, and square his yard arms, and brace up his elbows, in rig all snug and clever, just while his craft was taken in her water. I didn't like my berth though, howsomedever, because the yarn, you see, kept getting tauter. Says I wish this job was rather shorter. The chase had gained a mile ahead, and still the she mare stood a drinking. Now all the while, her body didn't take of course to shrinking. Says she's letting out her reefs, I'm thinking. And so she swelled and swelled, and yet the tackle held, till both my legs began to bend like winkin'. My eyes! But she took in enough to founder, and there's my timbers straining every bit, ready to split, and her tarnation hull a growing rounder. Well there, off Hertfordness, we lay both lashed and water logged together, and can't contrive a signal of distress. Thinks we must ride out this here foul weather, though sick of riding out, and nothing less. When looking round, I sees a man astern. "Hollo!" says come underneath her quarter, and hands him out my knife to cut the yarn. So I gets off, and lands upon the road, and leaves the she mare to her own concern, a standing by the water. If I get on another, I be blowed. And that's the way you see, my legs got bowed. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. The Volunteer and the Lover's Progress by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Volunteer. The clashing of my armor in my ears Sounds like a passing bell. My buckler puts me In mind of a bier. This, my broadsword, a pickaxe To dig my grave. The Lover's Progress. 'Twas in that memorable year France threatened to put off in Flat bottomed boats, intending each To be a British coffin, to make sad widows of our wives, and every babe an orphan. When coats were made of scarlet cloaks, and heads were dredged with flour, I listed in the Lorgers Corps, against the battle hour, A perfect volunteer, for why? I brought my will and power. One dreary day, a day of dread, like Cato's overcast, About the hour of 6, the morn, and I were breaking fast, There came a loud and sudden sound, that struck me all aghast, A dismal sort of morning roll, that was not to be eaten, Although it was no skin of mine, but parchment that was beaten. I felt tattooed through all my flesh, like any Otaheitan. My jaws with utter dread enclosed The morsel I was munching, And terror locked them up so tight, My very teeth went crunching All through my bread and tongue at once, Like sandwich made at lunching. My hand that held the teapot fast, Stiffened, but yet unsteady, Kept pouring, pouring, pouring o'er The cup in one long eddy, Till both my hose were marked with tea, As they were marked already. I felt my visage turn from red To white, from cold to hot, But it was nothing wonderful, My colour changed I wot, For like some variable silks, I felt that I was shot. And looking forth with anxious eye, From my snug upper story, I saw our melancholy corps Going to beds all gory. The pioneers seemed very loth To axe their way to glory. The captain marched as mourners march, The ensign too seemed lagging, And many more, although they were No ensigns, took to flagging. Like corpses in the Serpentine, Methought they wanted dragging. But while I watched, the thought of death Came like a chilly gust, And lo, I shut the window down, With very little lust, To join so many marching men, That soon might be March dust. Quoth I, since fate ordains it so, Our foe the coast must land on, I felt so warm beside the fire, I cared not to abandon. Our hearths and homes are always things That patriots make a stand on. The fools that fight abroad for home, Thought I, may get a wrong one. Let those who have no homes at all, Go battle for a long one. The mirror here confirmed me this Reflection by a strong one. For there where I was wont to shave, And deck me like Adonis, There stood the leader of our foes, With vultures for his armies. No Corsican, but Death himself, The bony of all bonies. A horrid sight it was, and sad, To see the grisly chap Put on my crimson livery, And then begin to clap My helmet on; ah me! it felt Like any felon's cap. My plumes seemed borrowed from a hearse, An undertaker's crest, My epaulets like coffin plates, My belt so heavy pressed, Four pipeclay crossroads seemed to lie At once upon my breast. My blazoned breastplate only lacked A little heap of salt, To make me like a corpse full dressed, Preparing for the vault, To set up what the poet calls My everlasting halt. This funeral show inclined me quite To peace, and here I am, Whilst better lions go to war, Enjoying with the lamb A lengthened life, that may have been A martial epigram. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. The Epping Hunt by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Advertisement. Striding in the steps of Strutt, the historian of the old English ports, the author of the following pages has endeavored to record a yearly revel, already fast hastening to decay. The Easter phase will soon be numbered with the pastimes of past times. Its dogs will have had their day, and its deer will be fallow. A few more seasons, and this city common hunt
will become uncommon.
In proof of this melancholy decadence, the ensuing epistle is inserted. It was penned by an underling at Kells, a person more accustomed to riding than writing. Sir, about the hunt. In answer to your inquiries, there has been a great falling off latterly, so much this year that there was nobody almost. We did smear nothing provisionally, hardly a bottle extra, which is proof in pint. In short, our hunt may be said to be in the last stage of a decline. I am, sir, with respects from your humble servant, Bartholomew Rutt. On Monday they began to hunt. Chevy Chase. John Huggins was as bold a man As trade did ever know. A warehouse good he had, that stood Hard by the church of Bow. There people brought Dutch cheeses round, And single Gloucester flat, And English butter in a lump, And Irish in a pat. 6 days a week beheld him stand
His business next his heart,
At counter with his apron tied
about
His counterpart. The 7th, in a sluice house box, He took his pipe and pot, On Sundays for Il Pitti, A very noted spot. Ah, blest if he had never gone Beyond its rural shed! One Eastertide some evil guide Put Epping in his head. Epping, for butter justly famed, And pork in sausage popped, Where winter time or summer time Pig's flesh is always chopped. But famous more, and annals tell, Because of Easter chase, There every year 'twixt dog and deer There is a gallant race. With Monday's sun John Huggins rose, And slapped his leather thigh, And sang the burthen of the song, "This day a stag must die." For all the livelong day before, And all the night in bed, Like Beckford he had nourished thoughts On hunting in his head. Of horn and morn, and hark and bark, And echoes answering sounds, All poet's wit hath ever writ In doggerel verse of hounds. Alas, there was no morning voice To whisper in his ear, "Thou art a fool in leaping cheap To go and hunt the deer." No thought he had of twisted spine, Or broken arms or legs, No chicken hearted he although 'Twas whispered of his egg. Ride out he would, and hunt he would, Not dreamt of ending ill, Mayhap with Doctor Ridout's fee, And Surgeon Hunter's bill. So he drew on his Sunday boots, Of lustre superfine, The liquid black they wore that day Was warranted to shine. His yellow buckskins fitted close, As once upon a stag, Thus well equipped he gaily skipped At once upon his nag. But first to him that held the rein A crown he nimbly flung, For holding of the horse, why no, For holding of his tongue. To say the horse was Huggins' own Would only be a brag. His neighbor Fig and he went halves, Like centaurs in a nag, And he that day had gone the gray, Unknown to brother Cit. The horse he knew would never tell, Although it was a tit. A well bred horse he was I wis, And he began to show, By quickly rearing up within, The way he ought to go. But Huggins, like a wary man, Was ne'er from saddle cast, Resolved by going very slow On sitting very fast. And so he jogged to Tots and Cross, An ancient town well known, Where Edward wept for Eleanor In mortar and in stone. A royal game of fox and goose To play on such a loss, Wherever she sat down her orts, Thereby he put a cross. Now Huggins had a crony here, That lived beside the way, One that had promised sure to be His comrade for the day. Whereas the man had changed his mind Meanwhile upon the case, And meaning not to hunt at all, Had gone to Enfield Chase. For why his spouse had made him vow To let a game alone, Where folks that ride a bit of blood May break a bit of bone. Now be his wife a plague for life, A coward sure is he. Then Huggins turned his horse's head, And crossed the bridge of Lee. Thence slowly on thro' Lakenstone, Past many a Quaker's box, No friends to hunters after deer, though followers of a fox, and many a score behind before the self same route inclined, and minded all to march one way, made one great march of mind. Gentle and simple, he and she, and swell and blood and prig, and some had carts and some a chaise, according to their gig. Some long eared jacks, some knackered hacks, however odd it sounds, let out that day to hunt instead of going to the hounds. And some had horses of their own, and some were forced to job it, and some, while they inclined to hunt, betook themselves to cob it. All sorts of vehicles and vans, bad, milding, and the smart, here rolled along the grey barouche, and there a dirty cart, and lo, a cart that held a squad of costermonger line, with one poor hack like Pegasus, that slaved for all the nine. Yet marvel not at any load that any horse might drag, when all that morn at once were drawn together by a stag. Now when they saw John Huggins go at such a sober pace, "Hallo!" cried they, "come trot away, you'll never see the chase." But John, as grave as any judge, made answer quite as blunt, "It will be time enough to trot, when I begin to hunt." And so he paced to Woodford Wells, where many a horseman met, and letting go the reins of course, prepared for heavy wet. And lo! within the crowded door, stood rounding jovial elf, here shall the Muse frame no excuse, but frame the man himself. A snow white head, a merry eye, a cheek of jolly blush, a claret tint laid on by health with Master Reynard's brush, a hearty frame, a courteous bow, the prince he learned it from, his age about threescore and ten, and there you have old Tom. In merriest key I trow was he, so many guests to boast, so certain congregations meet, and elevate the host. "Now welcome, lads," quoth he, "and prads, you're all in glorious luck, Old Robin has a run to day, a noted forest buck. Fair mead's the place where Bob and Tom in red already ride, 'Tis but a step, and on a horse you soon may go astride." So off they scampered, man and horse, at time and temper pressed, but Huggins, hitching on a tree, branched off from all the rest. Howbeit he tumbled down in time to join with Tom and Bob. All is fair mead, which held that day its own fair meed of mob. Idlers to wit, no guardians some, of tattlers in a squeeze, Ramblers in heavy carts and vans, spectators up in trees, Butchers on backs of butchers' hacks, that shambled to and fro, Bakers intent upon a buck, neglectful of the dough, Change alley bears to speculate, as usual for a fall, And green and scarlet runners such, as never climbed a wall. 'Twas strange to think what difference a single creature made, A single stag had caused a whole stagnation in their trade. Now Huggins from his saddle rose, and in the stirrups stood, And lo! a little cart that came hard by a little wood, In shapes like half a hearse, though not for corpses in the least, For this contained the deer alive, and not the deer deceased. And now became a sudden stir, and then a sudden shout, The prison doors were opened wide, and Robin bounded out. His antlered head shone blue and red, bedecked with ribbons fine, Like other bucks that come to list the hawbucks in the line. One curious gaze of mild amaze He turned and shortly took, then gently ran adown the mead, and bounded o'er the brook. Now Huggins, standing far aloof, had never seen the deer, till all at once he saw the beast come charging in his rear. Away he went, and many a score of riders did the same, on horse and ass like high and low, and Jack pursuing game. Good Lord, to see the riders now, thrown off with sudden whirl! A score within the purling brook enjoyed their early purl. A score were sprawling on the grass, and beavers fell in showers. There was another florer there, beside the Queen of Flowers. Some lost their stirrups, some their whips, some had no caps to show, but few, like Charles and Charing Cross, rode on in statu quo. Oh dear, now might you hear, I've surely broke a bone, my head is sore, with many more such speeches from the throne. Howbeit their wailings never moved the wide Satanic clan, who grinned as once the devil grinned to see the fall of man, and hunters good that understood their laughter knew no bounds, to see the horses throwing off so long before the hounds. For deer must have due course of law, like men the course among, before those barristers the dogs proceeded to giving tongue. And now old Robin's foes were set, that fatal taint to find, that always is sent after him, yet always left behind. And here observe how dog and man a different temper shows, what hound resents that he is sent to follow his own nose. Towler and Jowler, howlers all, no single tongue was mute, the stag had led a hart, and lo! the whole pack followed suit. No spur he lacked, fear stuck a knife and fork in either haunch, and every dog he knew had got an eye tooth to his paunch. Away, away, he scudded like a ship before the gale, now flew to hills we knew not of, now none like took the vale. Another squadron charging now, went off at furious pitch, a perfect Tam O'Shanter mob, without a single witch. But who was he with flying skirts, a hunter did endorse, and like a poet seemed to ride upon a winged horse. A whipper in, no whipper in, a huntsman's not such soul, a connoisseur or amateur, why yes, a horse patrol. A member of police for whom the county found a nag, and like Actaeon in the tale he found himself in stag. Away they went then, dog and deer, and hunters all away, the maddest horses they ever knew, mad staggers such as they. Some gave a shout, some rolled about, and anticked as they rode, and butchers whistled on their curs, and milkmen tally hoed. About 20 there were, not more, that galloped in the race, the rest, alas, lay on the grass, at once in chevy chase. But even those that galloped on were fewer every minute, the field kept getting more select, each thicket served to thin it. For some pulled up and left the hunt, some fell in murry bogs, and vainly rose and ran amuck to overtake the dogs. And some in charging hurdle stakes were left bereft of scent. What else could be premised of blades that never learned to fence? But roundings Tom and Bob no gate, no hedge, no ditch could say, or all they went and did the work of leap years in a day. And by their side see Higgins ride, as fast as he could speed, for like Mazeppa he was quite at mercy of his steed. No means he had, by timely check, the gallop to remit, for firm and fast between his teeth the biter held the bit. Trees raced along, all Essex fled beneath him as he sate. He never saw a county go at such a country rate. Hold hard, you'll lame the dogs, quoth Huggins, so I do. I've got the saddle well in hand, and hold as hard as you. Good Lord, to see him ride along, and throw his arms about, and if with stitches in the side, that he was drawing out. And now he bounded up and down, now like a jelly shock, till bumped and galled, yet nowhere gale for bumps did ever look. And rowing with his legs the while, and tars are apt to ride, with every kick he gave a prick deep in the horse's side. But soon the horse was well avenged for cruel smart of spurs, for riding through a moor he pitched his master in a furze. Where sharper set than hunger is, he squatted all forlorn, and like a bird was singing out, while sitting on a thorn. Right glad was he, as well might be, such cushion to resign. Possession is 9 points, but his seemed more than 99. Yet worse than all the prickly points that entered in his skin. His nag was running off the while the thorns were running in. Now had a Papist seen his sport, thus laid upon the shelf, although no horse he had to cross, he might have crossed himself. Yet surely still the wind is ill, that none can say is fair. A jolly wight there was that rode upon a sorry mare. A sorry mare that surely came of pagan blood and bone, for down upon her knees she went to many a stock and stone. Now seeing Huggins' nag adrift, the farmer, shrewd and sage, resolved, by changing horses here, to hunt another stage. Though felony, yet who would let another's horse alone, whose neck is placed in jeopardy by riding on his own? And yet the conduct of the man seemed honest like and fair, for he seemed willing, horse and all, to go before the mare. So up on Higgins' horse he got, and swiftly rode away, while Higgins mounted on the mare, down Brown upon a bay. And off they set, in double chase, for such was fortune's whim. The farmer rode to hunt the stag, and Higgins hunted him. Alas, with one that rode so well, in vain it was to strive. A dab was he, as dabs should be, all leaping and alive. And here of nature's kindly care, behold a curious proof. As nags are meant to leap, she puts a frog in every hoof. Whereas the mare, although her share she had of hoof and frog, on coming to a gate stopped short, as stiff as any log. Whilst Huggins in the stirrup stood, with neck like neck of crane, as sings the Scottish song, to see the gate has heart had gain. And lo, the dim and distant hunt diminished in a trice, the steeds like Cinderella's team seemed dwindling into mice, and far remote each scarlet coat soon flitted like a spark, though still the forest murmured back an echo of the bark. But sad as soul John Huggins turned, no comfort could he find, while thus the hunting chorus sped, to stay 5 bars behind. For though by dint of spur he got a leap in spite of fate, howbeit there was no toll at all, they could not clear the gate. And like Fitzjames he cursed the hunt, and sorely cursed the day, and mused anew Grace elegy on his departed grey. Now many a sign at Woodford town in invitation tells, but Higgins full of ills of course betook him to the Wells, where Rounding tried to cheer him up with many a merry laugh, but Huggins thought of neighbour Fig, and called for half and half. Yet spite of drink he could not blink remembrance of his loss. To drown a care like his required enough to drown a horse. When thus forlorn a merry horn struck up without the door, the mounted mob were all returned, the Epping Hunt was o'er. And many a horse was taken out of saddle and of shaft, and men by dint of drink became the only beasts of draught. For now become a harder one, of wine and gin and beer, and overtaken men discussed the overtaken deer. How far he ran, and eke how fast, and how at bay he stood, Deerlike resolved to sell his life as dearly as he could, and how the hunters stood aloof, regardful of their lives, and shunned a beast whose very horns they knew could handle knives. How Huggins stood when he was rubbed by help and ostler kind, and when they cleaned the clay before, how worse remained behind. And one, how he had found a horse adrift, a goodly grey, and kindly rode the nag for fear the nag should go astray. Now Huggins, when he heard the tale, jumped up with sudden glee. "A goodly grey! Why then I say, that grey belongs to me! Let me endorse again my horse, delivered safe and sound, and gladly I will give the man a bottle and a pound." The wine was drunk, the money paid, though not without remorse, to pay another man so much for riding on his horse. And let the chase again take place, for many a long, long year, John Huggins will not ride again, to hunt the Epping deer. Moral. Thus pleasure oft eludes our grasp, just when we think to grip her, and hunting after happiness, we only hunt a slipper. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. The Drowning Ducks by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Amongst the sights that Mrs. Bond enjoyed yet grieved at more than others, were little ducklings in a pond, swimming about beside their mothers, small things like living water lilies, but yellow as the daffodillies. "It's very hard," she used to moan, "that other people have their ducklings to grace their waters, mine alone have never any pretty chucklings. For why, each little yellow navy went down, all downy, to old Davy. She had a lake, a pond I mean, its wave was rather thick than pearly. She had two ducks, their napes were green. She had a drake, his tail was curly. Yet spite of drake, and ducks, and pond, no little ducks had Mrs. Bond. The birds were both the best of mothers, the nest had eggs, the eggs had luck, the infant D's came forth like others, but there, alas! the matter stuck. They might as well have all died addle, as die when they began to paddle. For when, as native instinct taught her, the mother set her brood afloat, they sank ere long right under water, like any overloaded boat. They were web footed, too, to see, as ducks and spiders ought to be. No peccant humour in a gander brought havoc on her little folks. No poaching cook, a frying pander, to appetite destroyed their yolks. Beneath her very eyes, oh rotten, they went, like plummets, to the bottom. The thing was strange, a contradiction, it seemed, of nature and her works. For little ducks, beyond conviction, stood float without the help of corks. Great Johnson, it bewildered him to hear of ducks that could not swim. Poor Mrs. Bond, what could she do but change the breed, and she tried divers, which dived as all seem born to do. No little ones were e'er survivors, like those that copied gems, I'm thinking, they all were given to die sinking. In vain their downy coats were shorn, they floundered still, batch after batch went, the little fools seemed only born, and hatched for nothing but a hatchment. Whene'er they launched, oh sight of wonder, like fires the water got them under. No woman ever gave their lucks a better chance than Mrs. Bond did. A lass quite out of hearts and ducks, she gave her pond up, and desponded For death among the water lilies, Cried "Duck and me" to all her dillies. But though resolved to breed no more, She brooded often on this riddle, Alas! 'twas darker than before. At last, about the summer's middle, What Johnson, Mrs. Bond, or none did, To clear the matter up, the sun did. The thirsty Cyrus dog like drank So deep his furious tongue to cool, The shallow waters sank and sank, And lo, from out the wasted pool, Too hot to hold them any longer, There crawled some eels as big as conger. I wish all folks would look a bit, In such a case, below the surface, And when the eels were caught and split By Mrs. Bond, just think of her face, In each inside at once to spy A duckling turned to giblet pie! The sight at once explained the case, Making the dame look rather silly, The tenants of that eely place Had found the way to Piccadilly, And so, by under water suction, Had wrought the little duck's abduction. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. A Storm at Hastings and the Little Unknown by Thomas Hood. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. 'Twas August. Hastings every day was filling. Hastings, that greenest spot on memory's waste, With crowds of idlers willing and unwilling To be bedipped, be noticed, or be braced, And all things rose a penny in a shilling. Meanwhile, from window and from door in haste, Accommodation bills kept coming down, Gladding the world of letters in that town. Each day poured in new coachfuls of new cits, Flying from London's smoke and dust annoying, Unmarried misses hoping to make hits, And new wed couples fresh from Tunbridge toying, Lacemen and placemen, ministers and wits, And Quakers of both sexes much enjoying A morning's reading by the ocean's rim, That sect delighting in the sea's broad brim. And lo! amongst all these appeared a creature, So small, he almost might a twin have been, With Miss Crawmachy, dwarfish quite in stature, Yet well proportioned, neither fat nor lean, His face of marvellously pleasant feature, So short and sweet a man was never seen. All thought him charming as the first beginning, Alas! ere long they found him far too winning. He seemed in love with Chance, and Chance repaid His ardent passion with her fondest smile. the sunshine of good luck, without a shade. He staked and won, and won and staked, the bile. It stirred many a man, and many a maid, to see at every venture how that vile Small gambler snatched, and how he won them too, a living Pam, omnipotent at loo. Miss Wiggins set her heart upon a box, 'twas handsome rosewood, and inlaid with brass, and dreamt 3 times she garnished it with stocks Of needles, silks, and cottons, but alas! She lost it wide awake, we thought Miss Cox Was lucky, but she saw 3 caddies pass To that small imp, no living luck could loo him, Sir Stamford would have lost his Raffles to him. And so he climbed, and rode, and won, and walked, The wondrous topic of the curious swarm That haunted the parade, many were balked Of notoriety by that small form, Pacing it up and down, some even talked Of ducking him, when lo! a dismal storm Stopped in, one Friday, at the close of day, And every head was turned another way, Watching the grandeur guest, it seemed to rise, Bulky and slow upon the southern brink Of the horizon, fanned by sultry sighs, So black and threatening, I cannot think Of any simile, except the skies Miss Wiggins sometimes shades in Indian ink, Misshapen blotchings of such heavy vapor, They seem a deal more solid than her paper. As for the sea, it did not fret, and rave, And tear its waves to tatters, and so dash on The stony hearted beach, some bards would have It always rampant, in that idle fashion, Whereas the waves rolled in, subdued and grave, Like schoolboys, when the master's in a passion, Who meekly settle in, and take their places, With a very quiet awe on all their faces. Some love to draw the ocean with a head Like troubled table beer, and make it bounce, And froth, and roar, and fling, but this I've said Surged in scarce rougher than a lady's flounce. But then, a grander contrast thus it bred, With the wild welkin seeming to pronounce Something more awful in the serious ear, As one would whisper a lion's near, Who just begins to roar, so the hoarse thunder Growled long, but low, a prelude note of death, As if the stifling clouds yet kept it under, But still it muttered to the sea beneath Such a continued peal, as made us wonder It did not pause more oft to take its breath, Whilst we were panting with the sultry weather, And hardly cared to wed 2 words together, But watched the surly advent of the storm, Much as the brown cheeked planters of the Barbadoes Much watch a rising of the negro swarm. Meanwhile it steered, like Odin's old Amadas, Right on our coast, a dismal coal black form. Many proud gates were quelled, and all bravadoes Of folly ceased, and sundry idle jokers Went home to cover up their tongs and pokers. So fierce the lightning flashed in all their days, The oldest smugglers had not seen such flashing, And they are used to many a pretty blaze, To keep their Hollands from an awkward clashing With hostile cutters in our creeks and bays, And truly one could think, without much lashing, The fancy, that those coasting clouds, so awful And black, were fraught with spirits as unlawful. The gay parade grew thin, all the fair crowd Vanished, as if they knew their own attractions, For now the lightning, though a near hand cloud, Began to make some very crooked fractions, Only some few remained that were not crowd, A few rough sailors, who had been in actions, And sundry boatmen, that with quick yells, Lest it should blow, were pulling up the rows. No flower, but a boat. Some more were hauling The Regent by the head. Another crew, with that same cry, peculiar to their calling, were having up the Hope, and as they knew, the very gods themselves oft get a mauling in their own realms, the seamen wisely drew The Neptune rather high on the beach, that he might lie beyond his bellows' reach. And now the storm, with its despotic power, had all usurped the azure of the skies, making our daylight darker by an hour, and some few drops, of an unusual size, few and distinct, scarce 20 to the shower, fell like huge teardrops from a giant's eyes. But then this sprinkle thickened in a trice, and rained much harder, in good solid ice. Oh, for a very storm of words to show How this fierce crash of hail came rushing o'er us! Handel would make the gusty organs blow Grandly, and a rich storm in music score us; But even his music seemed composed and low, When we were handled by this hailstone chorus, Whilst thunder rumbled with its awful sound, And frozen comfits rolled along the ground, As big as bullets. Lord, how they did batter Our crazy tiles! And now the lightning flashed Alternate with the dark, until the latter Was rarest of the two. The gush, too, dashed So terribly, I thought the hail must shatter Some panes, and so it did, and first it smashed The very square where I had chosen my station To watch the general illumination. Another, and another, still came in, And fell in jingling ruin at my feet, Making transparent holes that let me win Some samples of the storm. Oh, it was sweet To think I had a shelter for my skin, Calling them through these loopholes of retreat, Which in a little we begin to glaze, Chiefly with a jack towel and some baize. But which? The cloud had passed o'erhead, but played Its crooked fires in constant flashes still, Just in our rear, as though it had arrayed Its heavy batteries at Fairlight Mill, So that it lit the town, and grandly made The rugged features of the castle hill Leapt, like a birth, from chaos into light, And then relapsed into the gloomy night. As parcel of the clouds themselves, Like monstrous crags and summits everlasting, Piled on each in most gigantic shelves, That Milton's devils were engaged in blasting, We could e'en fancy Satan and his elves Busy upon those crags, and ever casting Huge fragments loose, and that we felt the sound That made in falling to the startled ground. And so the tempest scowled away, and soon, Timidly shining through its skirts of jet, We saw the rim of the Pacific moon, Like a bright fish entangled in a net, Flashing its silver sides. How sweet a boon Seemed her sweet light, as though it would beget, With that fair smile, a calm upon the seas, Peace in the sky, and coolness in a breeze. Meantime the hail had ceased, and all the brood Of glaziers stole abroad to count their gains. At every window there were maids who stood Lamenting o'er the glass small remains, Or, with coarse linens made the fractions good, Staunching the wind in all the wounded panes, Or, holding candles to the panes in doubt, The wind resolved, blowing the candles out. No house was whole that had a southern front, No greenhouse but the same mishap fell, Bow windows and bell glasses bore the brunt, No sex in glass was spared, for those who dwell On each hillside, you might have swum a punt In any of their parlors. Mrs. Snell Was slopped out of her seat, and Mr. Hitchin Had a flower garden washed into a kitchen. But still the sea was mild, and quite disclaimed The recent violence, each after each. The gentle waves a gentle murmur framed, Tapping like woodpeckers the hollow beach. Howbeit his weather eye the seaman aimed Across the calm, and hinted by his speech A gale next morning, and when morning broke, There was a gale, quite equal to bespoke, Before high water, it were better far To christen it not water then, but water, For then the tide is serving at the bar, Rose such a swell, I never saw one greater, Black, jagged billows rearing up in war, Like ragged warring bears against the baiter, With lots of froth upon the shingle shed, Like stout poured out with a fine beachy head. No open boat was open to a fare, Or launched that morn on 7 shillings trips, No bathing woman waded, none would dare A dipping in the wave, but waived their dips. No seagull ventured on the stormy air, And all the dreary coast was clear of ships, For 2 lee shores upon the river Lee Are not so perilous as one at sea. Awestruck we sat, and gazed upon the scene Before us in such horrid hurly burly, A boiling ocean of mixed black and green, A sky of copper color, grim and surely, When lo! in the vast hollow scoop between 2 rolling Alps of water, white and curly, We saw a pair of little arms a skimming, Much like a first or last attempt at swimming, Sometimes a hand, sometimes a little shoe, Sometimes a skirt, sometimes a hank of hair, Just like a dab seaweed rose to view, Sometimes a knee, sometimes a back was bare. At last a frightful somerset he threw, Right on the shingles, any one could swear The lad was dead, without a chance of perjury, And battered by the surge beyond all surgery. However we snatched up the corse thus thrown, Intending, Christian like, to sod and turf it, And after venting pity's sigh and groan, Then curiosity began with her fit, And lo! the features of the small unknown, 'Twas he that of the surf had had the surfeit, And in his fob, the cause of his late monopolies, We found a contract signed with Mephistopheles, A bond of blood, whereby the sinner gave His forfeit soul to Satan in reversion, Providing in this world he was to have A lordship over luck, by whose exertion He might control the course of cards, and brave All throws of dice; but on a sea excursion, The juggling demon, in his usual vein, Seized the last cast, and nicked him in the main. This recording is in the public domain.